All right, sounds good. All right, well, with that, I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's or morning, depending on where you're at, this authors engagement session with Professor Chris Riedy from University of Technology, Sydney. Um, Chris will be joining us to talk about his classic article from Journal of Future Studies from 2016, Interior Transformation on the Pathway to a Viable Future. Uh, this had gotten reposted from the archives a few months ago and got quite a bit of discussion going, got a lot of likes and shares on the platform on LinkedIn. So we approached Chris about having some discussion and reflection on the article and how things have changed since then, and his use of CLA in the article itself. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris, and let's have a great discussion, everybody.
Thanks, Edward. I mean, you sent me through some questions a while back, and so I figured I was just responding to those. So I'll go with that. Yeah, so I'm Chris Riedy. I'm a professor of sustainability transformations at the University of Technology, Sydney, in the Institute for Sustainable Futures there. And there's a bit of a I just also want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Darawal people in to the south of Sydney. I want to acknowledge elders past and present from those First Nations peoples. So this particular paper, I mean, it was I thought a really great initiative from Journal of Future Studies to bring back classics from the past, and I was very excited to see mine pop up, and a paper that it's quite dear to me. There's a bit of a backstory to it, so I'll tell some of that story. It was really it starts back just after I finished my doctoral research in 2005, and I was invited by Richard Slaughter to contribute to a special issue of Futures. He liked an appendix in my PhD and said, you should turn that into a journal article. And I was a fresh young academic and very excited at the opportunity to get a journal publication up and running. So I thought, I'll definitely do that. And the appendix was about, in my doctoral research, I used Ken Wilber's integral theory to look at Australia's response to climate change and took an integral futures approach. And so in the appendix, I was like, well, what would CLA look like? What would causal layered analysis look like if we applied it in a way that followed Ken Wilber's theory? And so I turned that into an article that really tried to revise CLA to fit in with the kind of quadrants and levels model that Ken Wilber had and that Richard Slaughter had brought to future studies. And quite naively sort of tried to bend and shape CLA into that mold. And the paper got published, and then I got a phone call from Sohail, and he was not happy. He was very, very disappointed in me, and said that I was colonizing his method, and that should have talked to him first and explored some of the ideas in the paper. And I was horrified because Sohail was a bit of a hero of mine and had really inspired some of the thinking in my doctoral research. And so I was like, oh, my first big journal article after my PhD, and it's all gone horribly wrong, and what have I done? And so obviously it led to a lot of reflection for me, and I came to see, and Sohail helped me to see, because they published another special issue in Futures critiquing the work that we did in our special issue as colonizing and as not sort of taking the methods on the merits of how they'd been developed. And I thought that criticism once I got over the shock and the pain that always comes with criticism. I was like, oh yeah, they're right. I've really I've not understood CLA enough as it's used by practitioners. I've tried to force it into another model, which why is that model superior to what CLA is already doing? Made a lot of mistakes, and so that was a sort of pretty important moment for me as a young academic. And in time, I came to write an article reflecting on the experience, which I called the Integral Futures Controversy. And I had that published in a Journal of Integral Theory and Practice, and really was saying, hey, they were right, I was wrong. I really need to learn from this. And I've used it as a sort of cautionary tale for my students ever since. But after all that, and I felt like I'd made amends with the article that I published afterwards, reflecting on things. I still had there was something left undone. I felt I wanted to use CLA properly, was the sort of instinct I was left with. I wanted to find a way to do honor to the method and not to be trying to force it into an integral theory Wilbur style approach. And so the opportunity came up in 2013, the first transformations conference came about in Oslo, the Transformations in a Changing Climate conference it was called, and it's ended up leading to a series of conferences that there's now been 6 every 2 years, and the emergence of something called the Transformations Community, which I'm very much involved in. And I've been to all of those conferences and even hosted the Sydney conference last year when it came to Australia. So at the very first one of these, I was, right, here's an opportunity to write something using CLA to explore this idea of transformation. And particularly I was interested in the idea of interior transformation, of how through changing ourselves, through changing the way that we see the world, the perspectives that we take, we can become better practitioners, we can become better futures thinkers, we can become better change agents, and help to facilitate transformation. And I didn't feel like that was being talked about a lot back then. So I thought, here's a chance to use CLA to explore that topic, which is what I did in the paper. And so first presented it at the Transformations Conference in 2013, and then went on to turn it into the paper that that was posted in 2016. And yeah, I really sort of through the process, I was trying to think, how can I honor both the sort of Wilbur integral futures approach and CLA as it's been developed, and really wanted to use CLA as the primary method and framing, but still brought some ideas in from integral theory to that, but didn't sort of force the two models to fit together. So yeah, that was the sort of the backstory of how the paper came about. How are we going to do this, Ed? Edward, are you going to ask me questions interview style, or do you want me to keep rolling along? What are you thinking?
Oh, please keep going, keep going. I'm just making some notes for maybe to start a discussion in the chat with to bring up with you. I think this is a great point that you bring up, and thanks for the personal reflections about for one, worrying about annoying Sohail, because believe me, I worry about annoying Sohail. But beyond that, yeah, this interesting struggle between using a method kind of as intended compared to, maybe you, me, somebody else sees something in a method, sees a potential use or application of it that even the creator of it didn't see. So I've liked this discussion so far about these points you made about having that pushback, that feedback from Sohail about it, but also how you've reconciled, how you've sought to reconcile with it.
Yeah, and I mean, there's definitely times when a method can be taken in a new direction and applied in a new way, and that can add to it. I just don't think that I did that. I think I made it worse in what I'd done, and so if I had strongly felt that, I was improving it in some way, and I might have stuck to my guns and contested Sohail's criticism of it, but I really did think it was a well-made criticism, and that it was also, this is a danger in transdisciplinary research, which is what I typically do, is that it's really hard to when you're trying to cover a lot of different fields, it's hard to go deep into all of them, and it's impossible to go deep into all of them. And so there was a little bit of a sense that, I hadn't really read enough about CLA when I was making those criticisms. I had taken some of the originating articles that Sohail wrote about the method and used those as the basis for my criticism, but there were so many applications of it by then, and the method had moved on, and I hadn't really kept up with those developments and how it was being used in practice. So well made criticism, I thought. So I mean, Edward, the second question that you sent me in the original email was about, how would you position your work within the greater body of futures studies knowledge? And I guess thinking about this particular piece of work, I didn't feel like the idea of interior transformation as something that's important to be thinking about for sustainability and for sustainable futures was being considered and talked about to a great extent at that time. So what I was trying to do with the work was to get more people thinking about interior futures, and what are the futures of our worldviews, our narratives, our inner values. And so in that sense, it was, trying to open up a new sort of frontier in futures work, and more particularly, I think, in sustainability work, which was just starting to grapple with this idea that most of what we've been doing in the field of sustainability has been really incremental change and reform, and it's not been anywhere near sufficient to grapple with the kind of challenges that we're facing. And so what we need is change of a much greater scale and breadth and depth, and that's the idea of transformation. And so it's been that sort of idea has become much more common now in both, I think, the futures field and in sustainability transformations thinking. And we've had things like the inner development goals become quite prominent. So I don't know if everyone here knows about those, but we've got the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals to try and meet by 2030 to make the world more sustainable. And what people came to realize in the challenge of trying to achieve those Sustainable Development Goals, which are things like renewable energy and climate action and zero hunger and ending poverty, people came to realize that we need to also be developing our inner capacities if we're going to be able to achieve those outer sustainable development goals. And so the idea of the inner development goals was born as a parallel set of goals to the sustainable development goals, the SDGs. And the inner development goals, there's I think 23 different skills that are recognized in those inner development goals. Things like humility, which is something I had to learn through my experience of the critique from Sohail. Critical reflection, which is something I probably didn't do enough of before putting out that article. empathy. So there's a whole range of skills that have now been identified as things we should be cultivating to make us better change agents, better futurists, better sustainability activists and transformers. And so that scholarship has really taken off, and there's a whole movement now around the inner development goals and what are the kind of practices that that can help to build those capacities and to cultivate those skills. So that's one sort of positioning of the work within the body of work of future studies, is trying to really lift that idea of interior transformation, the idea of inner development, and certainly not because of my article, but because of developments that have happened since then, that really has taken off, which is great. The other thing, I mean, when I read back over the article ahead of this session, of course, and one thing that really struck me was that the narratives that I developed towards the end of the article, the four sort of stories that emerged in the final layer of causal layered analysis, are very closely aligned with Jim Dator's scenario archetypes. And I didn't realize that at the time. It's very clear to me now, looking back, but I don't think I knew about those archetypes when I was writing the paper, and I felt like I was discovering these patterns of futures archetypes myself at the time. And so I was in parallel discovering something that was probably already well known, but yeah, as I was reading through them, I was like, oh, that's essentially the Jim Dator's four scenario archetypes, that the kind of the business as usual future, which I talked about as a techno utopia, and where we continue to develop technology to save ourselves from the worst of sustainability challenges. And I had the sort of terraforming ourselves narrative, which was really about restraint and about staying within the planetary boundaries, which is discipline and restraint, or constraint was another one of Jim's archetypes. I had the thriving earth as the final one, which is kind of the transformation future, and of course the we're all doomed dystopian future as well. So it was interesting. I didn't know I was connecting to that longer tradition of thinking about archetypes of scenarios that emerge in futures work, but it was a clear connection there in hindsight.
So did you slide into it kind of almost by accident a bit?
Slide into
discovering Sohail's and Dator's work.
I came to, well, it was, I mean, after, in fact, this article was, I think I said before, is a bit pivotal for me. It led to, it really it marked a bit of a shift in my work. So after this piece, I've worked a lot more on transformation of stories and narratives and discourses and social imaginaries, the role that the big stories, what Sohail in CLA would call the big myths of our society and culture. I've worked a lot more on how do we transform those myths? How do we, for example, the dominant myths of neoliberal capitalism that say the purpose of the economy is to deliver growth in gross domestic product, and it doesn't matter what that means for the environment or for social justice. We've got to keep delivering growth. We're all competitive. We will act to maximize our utility. These big sort of economic myths are all sort of contributing to the sustainability challenges that we're facing. So how do we develop new myths, recover old myths from Indigenous thinking, and How do we bring Southern thinking in? How do we help to create the sort of the narrative foundation for sustainability transformations? So I started doing a lot more work on that. And in that process, that's when I discovered Jim Dator's work and scenario archetypes, because I was exploring a lot more the types of stories, the types of narratives that people tell about sustainability. And there's a lot of work in that space, whether it's framed as environmental discourses and John Dryzek's work, or social imaginaries is a term that's getting a lot more attention now. There are these sort of archetypal stories and narratives and alternative narratives out there that I started looking for a lot more. And so yeah, it wasn't long before I came across the scenario archetypes in that process. One other thought is that, you know, I think I talked in the paper about the sort of the myth that emerged at the end, which I was talking about as, you know, it would be great if this was the narrative that could start to emerge about a thriving Earth. I don't think the idea of thriving and thrivability has taken off to quite the extent that I hoped it might, but something that has taken off is the idea of regeneration and regenerative futures, which is really closely related. So I think, you know, in terms of going back to that question about positioning my work in futures studies, I think the rise of regenerative futures work and looking at this idea of sustainability is not enough. A sustainable future is not the goal. It's a transition point where we stop doing damage, but it's all that we would be doing is surviving then, and trying to move towards a future where we're thriving, we're restoring damage that's been done to the earth and to its people, and we're regenerating is you know, a really great basis for new narratives and imaginaries, I think. Just having a look at the chat to
Right.
see.
Yeah, that's great. Does it's maybe a little bit early at this point, but does anybody want to jump in with questions or comments to push the discussion?
I can ask. So Chris, you used the word interior transformation rather than inner self transformation. Is there a difference, or is it just a word choice?
Yeah, just a word choice. The interior probably comes more from Ken Wilber's work, where he, in his framing of the quadrants, he tends to use the terms interior and exterior as one of his key distinctions. And so I was still using that term when I wrote this paper. I probably don't use it as much now. The language that's being used in the sustainability transformations community now is more about inner development and inner capacities. And so I've started using that language myself, but I think they're very much the same thing. It's they're fairly interchangeable.
All right, very
hello.
good. Oh,
how
yeah,
do
please,
you,
Marcel.
How do I, hello. Just a couple of things, Chris. I did attend and present a workshop at Transformations 23, and it was very exciting. And I attended a lot of other people's workshops, and there was so much sort of visualization, meditation, breathing incorporated into whatever activity it was, which is extremely unusual, to the degree that it was sort of everyone almost did incorporate something like that, which was fantastic. So that was one thing. And the other thing was I didn't realize you couldn't play around with people's theories and methodologies, to be honest. And and I'm focusing totally on the narrative level of CLA, and sort of saying, well, you can forget the rest if you don't get that level, sorted a bit. And I'm hoping that I don't get into trouble for that. I just thought that it was free, that you could be free, that you could. So that's quite interesting, because I also thought, well, like today, Meadows' leverage points, that there's some parallels with CLA. And I was thinking, I wonder what I could do with those parallels. So you've alerted me to something that I didn't realise.
Well,
Thank
I
you.
don't want you to get the wrong idea, Marcel. You can and should play with other people's theories, and that's one of the great ways that theories and methods and frameworks get pushed forward and improved. What happened with the case I'm talking about is that I did that in a really clumsy way, in which there was an assumption throughout what I wrote that the integral theory was superior in every way to CLA.
Okay.
So this was I was really starry-eyed about Ken Wilber's theory. It had been the basis of my doctoral research. It had helped to explain a lot of things for me, and I started trying to force other theories and methods and frameworks into that mold. And in doing that, sometimes you lose what was really best about the thing you were working with. And so that's,
yes,
I think it's important to do it in a critically reflective way, and ideally to talk to people and test those ideas out before you publish them with people that could point out to you what you were doing. And so if I just had a chat to Sohail and sent him an early draft, I could have sorted all that issue out before
right.
getting into publication. But I think you're right about the parallels between Janella Meadows' leverage points and CLA. So she talked about the working, what are the things you can work with in a system that have the most leverage to create change, and up the sort of end of the lever with the most leverage, she had things like paradigms and worldviews. And so
Absolutely.
if you can shift the paradigm, the worldview, the narrative associated with a system, then you've got much more potential to create system change than if you're just changing some of the quantitative parameters of a system. So totally, when in CLA you dig down beneath the litany and the social causes layer down to the worldviews and discourses and the myths and metaphors, that's a similar sort of progress to moving out along the lever in Janella Meadows' model.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, Basir, did you want to jump in
Yes,
to ask? Yeah, go ahead.
yes, please. This is a wonderful session, Chris, and thank you for being very open and providing all of these seamless experience. So on the transdisciplinary studies, so a lot of the times people have a difficulty grasping interdisciplinary studies, and then when you go transdisciplinary studies as someone on the outside, could you please summarize it, just your experience, or what would be the way to start? What would be the way to effectively carry out a transdisciplinary study? Like, what would be, let's say, if I wrote a work with a intention and research in transdisciplinary studies, what would you like to see? Thank you, and present your copy, advanced copy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of different ideas about what transdisciplinary research is, but one distinction that I like is, if you think of interdisciplinary work, is when academics from different disciplines get together and try and integrate their work. They try and come up with research questions together. They co-design the research. They co-produce the research. They write and publish together. That's interdisciplinary. And the difference in transdisciplinary is that we do all of that, but we also aim to involve actors from outside academia in that process as well. And that makes it really challenging. So the other language that gets used for this now is co-production of knowledge. And so to really be doing transdisciplinary research or co-production of knowledge, you need to be involving the actors that are relevant to whatever the topic is that you're working on right from the start of that process. And they may actually be, they might be people in business, they could be policymakers and decision makers, they could be activists, they could be citizens, community members, and they would get involved from the start. They would help to define what the research questions are. So they wouldn't come just from the academic literature, but they would come from the everyday experience of those people. What are the challenges that they're facing? And often, although there is a tendency for those actors to take a little bit of a step back once you get into the actual doing of the research, because that's where the experts have a bit more of the experience. But sometimes they'll do the research as well if they're interested. They might be doing some of the data collection, doing some of the analysis work. And then really importantly, those actors will help to get the knowledge out to where it can make the most difference. So that means, sure, we would still do peer-reviewed publications, but it's also getting articles out into newsletters and reports that are useful for their communities. So it's something you can't do solo. So you can't really do a transdisciplinary PhD, for example. It needs broader collaboration than that. And it's really time consuming. So doing all of that involvement of such a broad group of people takes a lot of time just to find common language, because you have, even if everyone speaks English, words are used in different ways in different disciplines. You don't even realize it for a while. And you really have to take time to start to get on the same page, as it were. And then you've got to take time to build trust, and to often there's a process of letting go of some of the research questions that you really personally want to answer because nobody else is interested in those ones, and finding the ones that you actually share. And all of that can be really slow. So despite that, there's really great examples of transdisciplinary research projects around the world now, but most of them tend to be really multi-year, well-funded projects that really have the time to develop that common ground and that trust, and to build a narrative together about what it is that they're trying to do.
Thank you very much, crystal clear.
Let's see, who had asked, Ilyas, if you had asked a very insightful question here in the chat. Would you like to pose it to Chris? If you're still, if you're there.
Can just read the questions, maybe.
Yeah, I'll give it a read. Ilyas had asked, often in the real world, changing ourselves to change at scale to make real transformations have the impact we need will take more time than humanity has based on the problems we create. On the other hand, power systems, industries, and relationships between players and nations, investments in foundational technologies are safe for all to use, and global agreements that can influence our lives is not part of the equation. What can we do to change this narrative that excludes futures that already have been colonized for us?
Wow, it's a tough question. Yeah, I mean, there's this real sense of when you're working on sustainability and sustainable futures, there is this real sense of urgency that drives your work, and this idea that you'll hear it talked about as this is the last decade we have to make a difference on climate change. It's the critical decade, and so if we don't turn things around before 2030, we're in deep trouble. And if you look around you at all the data on what's happening to the climate, what's happening to biodiversity, there's no doubt that we're losing incredible richness on the planet every day, and that brings a terrible sense of urgency to the work that we do to try and bring about sustainable futures. And yet to really be able to respond to those challenges means not acting in a reactive way, means not jumping into problems and perhaps making them worse. It means actually at the 2023 Transformations Conference, my friend Donnie McClurkin put it really well, and he did a keynote presentation, and he said, when a firefighter gets to a fire, they're taught not to sort of jump out of the fire engine and run straight to the fire and immediately take action. They're taught to just put their hands in their pockets and just stand and have a look at the situation first and make sure they work out, all right, what's going on here? What are the dangers? What is the thing that I need to act on first? And after they've paused to take in the situation, and you can think of that as taking in the system if we're thinking about system change and transformations, then you can start to take action. And he talked about it as slowing down to speed up. And so that's what I'm talking about with inner development and inner transformation, is that for us to be better at system change, for us to work more skillfully with the kind of leverage points that Danella Meadows talks about, and for us to see the ways that we can connect up things that are already happening to more effectively facilitate transformations, we might need to work on ourselves first. And that might mean that while we're doing that, while we're learning, we're not jumping in and having those urgent impacts that we would hope to be having. But by doing that, we create the conditions where we can start to then really speed up transformation. And on my really optimistic and hopeful days, I think that a lot of people, since I wrote this paper, have started to develop those capacities, and that we are seeing a lot more people both in the futures community, in the sustainability transformations community, that are trying to work at the scale of changing entire systems. And they're trying to work on where are the pressure points where we can make a really big difference through smaller actions, this sort of idea of acupuncture in systems. What are the ways that we can realize that we don't have to create the whole transformation, that there's lots of people out there working on these issues, but that they're poorly connected up. And if we could connect them up better, and people could learn from each other more, then we would start to be triggering transformation as well. And the idea, which I've seen recently in Karen O'Brien's work, of fractal agency or fractal change, which is the idea that when we're trying to bring about better futures, we're trying to change narratives, we're trying to combat that the neoliberal capitalist narrative that I was talking about earlier. It's not about tackling it head on and trying to come up with another big new narrative to beat the narrative of neoliberal capitalism, because that could fall into the same trap of marginalizing lots of people and becoming the new big narrative that leaves lots of people behind. Instead, it's about living out a different set of values at the scale that you can live it out. And if Karen O'Brien's idea of fractal agency says that just by lots of people living out a different set of values, starting to prefigure what a different future would feel like, we start to build that future, and that future is being built all around us. And as we connect up those fractals, a new future starts to emerge. So that's a long answer to that difficult question, but I think it is trying to get at that last part about what we can do to change a narrative that excludes futures that already have been colonized for us. It's about living the future that we want at the scale that we can, and trusting that lots of other people are doing that as well, and making connections with others that are doing it whenever we can. And so groups like this that you come into, you'll find like-minded people that are living that way, and you can connect up with.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I really like this point here. This future we want at the scale that we can. Right. This is and I've never heard this concept of fractal agency, but I'm loving it immediately. The idea that that just but it's quite insightful, isn't it, that the change can start at that tiny fractal point, that and from there can lead potentially to system-wide change. Right.
Yeah, and I can see some people have pointed out in the chat some of Karen's other work around. So she's explored the idea of quantum social change and trying to develop a quantum social theory, and that part of what she's doing there is that even our ideas about how social change happens are still very caught up in the kind of old physics models of cause and effect and linear progress and so on. And what she's trying to do, and other theorists in that field, is to try and think, well, what does our new knowledge in physics mean in terms of metaphors that we might be able to bring to social change? And so the fractal idea is one idea there, but also ideas of entanglement, which is another quantum theory idea, that something that happens in one place can have an influence on something that happens somewhere else. And so this idea that we're all entangled with each other, that we're affecting each other, I think ties in closely with that idea of fractal agency. But I think, particularly the trying to recognize that there are, in the cracks between the current system, there are new futures emerging all the time, and new futures being built all around us, and we're living in different futures. What's that? The William Gibson quote, "The future is already here. It's just not well distributed yet." So I think part of the work I've been trying to do recently is trying to amplify the stories of new futures already emerging. And I mean, there was one, I noted down a line from my paper that was really happy to see there when I read it again, which was that one possible strategy emerging at this level is to continually draw attention to the transformations that are already taking place all around us. So I was really happy to see that, because it's work that's been happening more recently, for example, in the field of well-being economics, and Catherine Trebek's work has really been trying to shine a light on the practices that are already happening that are part of an alternative economy, for example. And this idea that the seeds of different futures are being built around us all the time, and we just don't see it. And I'm working, have a relatively new doctoral student that I'm working with who's looking at the idea of the care economy and how to alternative futures around the care economy. And we've been talking about how, we think of the economy as this sort of, it's a space of competition, and it's about money and getting paid for your work and everything, but we're all always also engaged in this care economy where we trade services, we look after each other, we don't expect to get paid for it, and we don't think of it as part of the economy, but it is just as much. And so there's this basis, this foundation for a different narrative about our economy, which just doesn't get attention at the moment. So I think part of the interior transformation work that I talk about in the paper is starting to see those different stories, those different narratives around us, and trying to give them voice, to give them life.
All right, very good. Stephen, did you want to jump in here at this with comments, questions? Or are you indisposed at the moment? Yeah, jump
No,
in
no, no.
whenever,
I'm here, and I'm thoroughly confused. Doris just had this really good comment about the firefighters, and I'm just thinking, I lived in the forest and the mountains, so dealt with forest fires on a regular basis, and you would often see firefighters developing a fire line. So you jump way ahead of the fire and the flames, build a clearing to stop the forest, but you acknowledge losing a portion of the forest. The application of that in social terms is, and I think some long-termism, sort of advocates would say, well, we're just going to have to sacrifice a good chunk of human population to save humanity. So this idea of thinking about the future from that perspective, I think, is problematic for many of us, but the pragmatists might see it differently. But then going to, I think, Ilis's question about how do we do this, and to me, so much of the change happens at the margins. If you look at Meadows' 12 leverage points, those paradigm shifts, I think you can start at the top, but I think changing those paradigm shifts at the margins is often kind of where a tipping point can occur, and indirectly through entanglement and fractal agency, you kind of hope for the best, but this does not align well with our desire for control and linear thinking and trying to, manage the change when it really might be a little more chaotic than we like to think. So that is my rambling at this stage, Ed, since you made me unmute myself.
Got you voluntold. Sorry, Stephen. But yeah, it's a great insight there. And yeah, this I'm somehow taken back to geology class in high school, where this idea that change happens at the margins, right? Literally, continents meet, volcanic eruptions happen, one continent subsumes over the top of the other, in the slow incremental change, but always there at the margins. What starts small can become big. So that potential there for transformation. I mean, these are great insights, great metaphors for thinking about it. And yeah, this idea of the fire line. I having grown up, with the mountains in directly in view back in Pennsylvania. Certainly, I've seen a forest fire or two happening off in the distance, and yeah, seeing that dividing line artificially put in to stop the entire forest from getting subsumed. Yeah, these are useful ideas and insights.
Yeah, and I mean, on Stephen's point, I would never want to advocate, hey, let's just let a whole bunch of people go so that we can save the rest. And so this is the big tension here. The dilemma is that, maybe we can't do this transformation challenge, this system change challenge well and skillfully enough and quickly enough without stepping back and taking some time. But that time means losses. That's continual losses the whole time that we're learning how to get better at this. So how do we, try and be doing what we can while trying to get better at that system scale? And I don't think we've got the answer to that. Certainly, I hope it's not going to take millions of years, like Stephen's comment. But there is something about that point about the margins, and it's the idea that in social sciences get talked about as liminality, the sort of the ambiguous spaces, the spaces at the margins is where a lot of the really interesting thinking and practice emerges from. And as we as the world gets more complex and there's more crises going on, I think there's more and more of those liminal spaces emerging, and it's a resource for change and transformation. Yeah, but I see a hand up from Stephen.
Oh yeah, Stephen, please.
Yeah, just, what you were saying there, Chris, it reminds me of something that as an American is now on my mind and actually reinvigorated with Joe Biden stepping down and Kamala Harris coming in and uniting a group of people that really are on the margins versus these mega donors and like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and these sort of individuals that think, hey, we have a plan and a strategy and we're going to buy the Supreme Court. We're going to buy the presidency. We're going to buy this. And it's coming with millions of dollars and lots of nice trips for Clarence Thomas to Fiji. And so, but the sense that Kamala there's an authenticity with the perceived authenticity. I think politicians are kind of all of the same stripe in some ways, but she in a different sort of approach, not the grumpy old white man, approach is reinvigorating something from the margins. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see what movements can happen out of that to counterbalance, people's $10, $20 versus Peter Thiel's, $2 billion investment in Donald Trump. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in an election system in the United States that has really upended the way things maybe have traditionally been done.
Yeah, great point. And I mean, this has reminded me of something else that I noticed when I was rereading my paper, and that was that I had nothing to say back in 2016 about Indigenous perspectives. I had nothing to say about Southern perspectives. It was a really, it was a white male Eurocentric piece of writing, and I've learned a lot since then, and I've really been on a journey to understand the narratives and worldviews of First Nations people in Australia, and it's really influenced my work. And I've worked with people from the South and have been on a sort of constant process of decolonization of my own thinking. And I think that the ideas that we need, the futures that we need, are coming from those marginal perspectives, the Indigenous thinking, Southern thinking that has incredible richness and has been, developed over tens of thousands of years in Australia to know how to live sustainably on this continent, which is a very different type of continent to the European colonizers. So there's just so much to learn from the margins, and amplifying those voices and helping their futures to emerge is, I think, the really important work.
And Chris, to that point, I find it so.
Yeah. Oh, please go ahead.
Sorry, Ed. I find it so intriguing that some of the most innovative future thought that is, deemed that category is I'm going to use the word used future from Sahel, but it's really not. It's just going back to a lot of indigenous thinking that has been around for millennia, and someone repackages it, and because it comes with all the bells and whistles of modern day sort of technology, we jump on it. But if you start pulling the principles and values and underlying ethos to it, it's like, well, it's not that much different from Aboriginal entities in Australia, and groups in Australia, and Native Americans and everything. So it's all, again, this whole idea of decolonizing things and pulling it apart. I think is something that futurist is something that we always just need to be cognizant of, and working in that sort of space.
Yeah, totally agree.
All right. Did anyone else want to have a quick last comment or question before we wrap up?
I just wanted to say thank you very much. It's been a great session. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Agreed. Thank you, Michael.
I do see a question in the chat from Ilias on inner development or intra-development with others, social. And I think if you have a look, if you haven't looked at the inner development goals before, and you look through the 23 skills, you'll see that a lot of them are about being with others, and there's a category that's about relating and connecting. And so those skills, while some of them are skills you might cultivate individually, a lot of them are things that you would cultivate with others, and I think are probably best cultivated with others, and need to be cultivated with others. Things like empathy, you need to be talking with others to develop that. So inner and intra development, I think, Ilias.
Well, I'd like to also add or ask for I'd love if you either mention or type into the chat some of your own recommended reading. You mentioned a few folks whose work I'm not familiar with, but it all sounds really great. People who perhaps have been inspired by your work since it was originally published, or other work you've done, or work that you find similar, related, relatable. There's been a lot of folks have put in the chat there some of the useful work that they've run across. So yeah, any names that you would like to recommend, or specific works that you'd like to recommend to us, Chris? Because I'm definitely all ears for it.
I've just popped one into the chat there, which is about So it's a fairly recent piece on integrating inner and outer transformation in sustainability science. So some of if you look also, Christine Wamsler, who is the final author on that paper, has written a lot in this space and has contributed to the work on the inner development goals. The Inner Development Goals has an excellent website, so I think it's worth going and having a look at that. There was a couple of reports that were done that led to the development of the goals, so they're worth reading also. Highly recommend Karen O'Brien's work. She was the host of the 2013 Transformations Conference that I was talking about, and has written on quantum social change, but also various frameworks for thinking about transformations, 3 spheres of transformation model, which is really helpful. I see Marcel's mentioned Sand Talk, which is by Tyson Yonkaporta, an Indigenous scholar from Australia. Excellent, excellent book as well. And he's got a more recent one called Right Story, Wrong Story, which I haven't actually read that one yet, but I've heard it's good. And I've gone blank on anything else, but that's
Well,
probably...
hey, thanks for these. I think I've heard of Sand Talk before. I think Marcel has actually mentioned it in previous session or elsewhere. It sounds familiar.
Oh, and Marcel, thanks for Rob Hopkins on imagination as well. Book from what is to what if is fantastic. And
It is.
he's also done something called with Rob Shorter called the Imagination Sundial, which is a great sort of summary of things you can be cultivating to help build spaces for imagination, which I think is really relevant to futures work. There's some other really good books on imagination. Jeff Mulgan has written a book on imagination as well, which I think some of the work in the UK on imagination infrastructure is talking about how there's not enough spaces in our society to imagine and to think about different futures, and they're trying to work out how to build those spaces. So Rob Hopkins, Cassie Robinson, Jeff Mulgan are all working in that kind of space of how do we help citizens to imagine more readily different kinds of futures when everyone's so busy. Jeff Mulgan is spelt a little bit.
Did I spell Mulgan correct? M-U-L-G-N? Mulgan. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. Geoff. Okay. Yeah. Follow Chris's spelling, not mine, if you're searching.
Is it okay? Can I jump in